G'day and welcome to the Off-Chain Podcast. Don here with you. My voice today, not so great, but our guest is great. Charles Hua, founder of powerlines.org. This US energy consumer advocacy nonprofit aims to modernize the utility regulatory system for American energy consumers to lower energy bills and grow the economy. Recently, he was nominated for the Times Next 100 Changemakers for 2025. Charles is passionate about energy advocacy and research and building a better power system for consumers and businesses. We're really excited to speak with Charles about why increased electricity consumption by data centers and big tech drives prices, and why infrastructure investments are needed now to deal with increased electricity demand. If your electricity prices have gone up, you're going to really enjoy today's show with Charles. Let's dive in. Tell us about your origin story. How did you become the founder of Powerlines?
Well, first off, thanks for having me on. I've become very obsessed with public utility commissions, especially over the last couple of years. Powerlines is a new national energy consumer advocacy nonprofit in the U.S. focused on basically this question of how do we lower utility bills while advancing economic development. And in the U.S. context, there are these 200 public utilities commissioners that oversee more than $200 billion a year in utility spending. And that's $1 billion per commissioner. So we call them the U.S. Supreme Court Justices of Energy. That's how much power that they have.
Right.
Yet very few people in the energy space really know who they are, what they do, why they matter. So from our point of view, this was a huge missed opportunity and a gap in the advocacy ecosystem that we felt particularly motivated to fill. And we started Powerlines about a year ago. Prior to that, I was a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy, working on grid modernization. And we kept on seeing similar issues around utility regulatory barriers being the reason why we're not deploying more of these advanced grid technologies or other solutions that can really make our grid more modern and efficient and power new sources of electricity demand. And I just felt this urgency to really tackle this issue of how do we take that utility regulatory system that we created over 100 years ago in the US and take that into the modern era.
So you saw you could do more outside of the system than inside? Is that kind of the dynamic?
That's perhaps part of it. I think that in this moment, there is just so much happening in the energy system globally and in the US. Put it this way, I think that the biggest macroeconomic issue of our time is AI and data centers.
Sure.
And the biggest microeconomic issue in the US, at least right now, if you look at the data, is electric and gas prices, is rising utility bills. And the intersection of those two things, the intersection of the biggest macroeconomic issue and the biggest microeconomic issue, in my opinion, is these public utility commissions, is this utility regulatory system, because these are the people that basically both set utility bills and determine the sources of new electricity that are going to power new sources of demand like AI and data centers. And in the US, what a lot of the tech companies have identified as their biggest bottleneck right now is access to electricity and speed of getting connected to the grid. And so from that standpoint, I think that these bodies, these public utility commissioners, are just so powerful, and we haven't had a concerted effort to really shine a light on how powerful they are and really make sure that they're protecting consumers and centering the public interest in their day-to-day and in their big picture work, that it's time for us to really re-engage that body and make sure that they're ultimately advancing the objectives of the public interest going forward.
Do you think people typically know that this body even exists, or are they just relating with their retailers and the government generally? I think there's this kind of black box of government out there, and then I deal with my retailer. Do you think people are even aware that, I mean, genuinely, that there is really a grid and how it works, and there are people in charge of it? Is that on people's radar, do you think?
Not at all. And I think that's inherently a privilege to not be aware of the grid, because it means that for a while it's been working reasonably well. Not in every case. There are people that have still, even in the US, lack access to electricity. There are people who get shut off from the power system either because they can't pay their bills or because the grid is just not reliable in the region. There are people who pay more than 6% of their income on energy, that's considered energy burdened, meaning that they're paying an outsized share of their income on energy. There are, in fact, 80 million Americans right now that are struggling to pay their utility bills. That's almost 1 in 3 households. People in the US aren't even aware of just the severity and the scope of the problem of energy poverty and being able to afford people's electricity and gas and utility bills. So that has really changed recently in terms of just how much more salience this issue has gotten. And with it, there is more of a spotlight around public service commissions. In fact, actually last week in the state of Georgia, there was an election for 2 public service commissioners. And this was the first time in the history of the state where those commissioners were the only positions on the ballot. Georgia is one of 10 states that elects their utility regulators in the US. And it just so happened to be the only election statewide on the ballot for Georgia. And for the first time in more than almost 20 years, the incumbent commissioners lost election in Georgia in what some might consider one of the more captured regulatory environments in the country. So that was a pretty remarkable outcome that made its way even on things like the Comedy Central's The Daily Show and Pod Save America and MSNBC and the New York Times and Politico and Time Magazine and The Economist. So many outlets were talking about this because of just how shocking in many senses this outcome was. Yet, to be very clear, the vast majority of Americans have no idea that this body exists. We actually did some polling on this, and more than 9 in 10 Americans couldn't name their state utility regulator.
Okay. Even though it's a significant part of their life, and like you say, you pay more than 6% of your income, and you're looking at a burden on yourself or on your household, that seems like a big deal. In terms of people starting to talk about it, or it making the national news, and there's different kinds of media outlets talking about it, do you think it's rising to prominence because of how shocking it was, or is it also because everybody is aware, or most people are aware of the significant rise in the price of electricity? It's not just in America as well. It seems to be across the globe. Even like in my own city, I remember about 5 years ago, put a big solar array on my roof. Power bills dropped down to zero. It was wonderful. A couple of years later, power bills creep up to $100 a month. Late last year, they're still back up to $300 or $500 a month for electricity. So we chuck on a battery and chuck on some more solar. Bills come down, but then we're already seeing them start to sneak up again. And I'm like, how we can afford to put in a battery and put in some solar panels, but people who can't do that, this must be, really life altering and super challenging. Do you think this is why things like you said, 9 out of 10 people can't even put a name to these people, but all of a sudden people all over are talking about it just because of just how relevant and real it is and tangible this problem has become to people? Or do you think it's just the political nature of how shocking it was?
Oh, absolutely. The fact that rising utility bills is now a national issue in America. And I don't have as much context on what's happening in other countries, but I would certainly believe that it's a global phenomenon. But even within the US, like if you were looking at this issue even as recently as a year ago, a common reaction that reporters would have when they asked us about it was, well, isn't this just a California and New England issue? In other words, isn't this just something that a couple states are experiencing? And the reality is that at this point, no, it's definitively a national issue where every region, almost every state is experiencing some challenges around rising electric prices. To put some numbers onto this, in the US, residential or retail electricity prices have increased about 40% since 2021. And it is significantly outpacing inflation. If you look at the latest consumer price index or CPI data, official government data, electricity and gas are actually the 2 fastest drivers of inflation, even outpacing things like rent, car insurance, groceries, gas. It's now the leading indicator of inflation. And in a moment in the US where economic pressures remain profound, where arguably that was the defining role in the 2024 election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And I think what we saw last Tuesday was that in the New Jersey governor's race, in the Virginia governor's race, and the Georgia Public Service Commission election, 3 statewide elections, rising utility bills was a top issue in all three of them. And that's a pretty remarkable new development. And I think the reason why it was a top political issue is that suddenly a lot of people are feeling the pain around their utility bills. They don't feel like there's been enough solutions to tackle those issues. And now they're yearning, they're desperately seeking leadership from their elected officials, from their politicians to really champion this issue going forward. And we're now seeing this bubble up into the national political discourse.
So,
Okay.
so everyone's feeling it. Electricity and just energy prices are driving inflation, not just trailing inflation. What do you think is the biggest misconception around power pricing that people have? What is it that we don't understand? Or do we understand? Is it just big bad government or greedy power suppliers? Or is it just the market demand, supply and demand? What don't we get about rising power prices or power prices?
There's so much. There's so much, frankly, that we don't understand. Arguably, even grid experts don't fully understand. That's just how complicated and arcane and opaque a lot of this is. To give an example, in the US, the reason why electricity is such a complicated issue is that state by state, region by region, it differs a lot in terms of the electricity market structure. So you'll have what are called regional transmission organizations, which cover the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, parts of California, for instance, and Texas. These are where there are competitive markets for generation. So anything from solar and wind and natural gas and coal and nuclear and hydropower, there are these competitive markets. But then in the West and in the Southeast, they don't have these markets. So it's just vertically integrated utilities where the utility owns generation, transmission, and distribution. And then there are some states that are vertically integrated utilities and they're in a market. There are some states that don't have any vertically integrated for-profit utilities. It's all public power. Like Nebraska only has public power. So it's such a balkanized electricity system where literally every state has something that's a little bit different about it. So it's hard to make general conclusions. That's one thing that people don't understand. But there are some general conclusions that you can make. And even then, a lot of misconceptions prevail. So for instance, what has driven up utility bills and electricity prices in America, a lot of the discourse that we see at the national level makes it seem like it must be clean energy, it must be fossil fuels, it's only one or the other. But in fact, when you look at the data, it's actually really neither so much as the grid. It's the transmission, it's the distribution, the poles and wires that are going across highways and your backyards and neighborhoods. Those steel and other, poles and wires cost a lot of money. And utility spending on those poles and wires has really increased over the last several years. In fact, just take distribution lines. These are the local poles and wires in your backyard. In the US in 2023, that made up almost half of all utility capital spending. So that's really what's driving up costs. But there's a lot of people that don't necessarily realize that. There are other factors that have driven up bills, including extreme weather events, including volatile fuel prices like natural gas, especially during, for instance, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, where those prices really spiked. Those do play a role, to be clear, but that's one misconception. And now when we think about a lot of the coverage, it's AI is doing this to prices, when in reality, it's a lot more complicated.
So you can't blame Ukraine and Russia solely. You can't blame greedy power companies. Can't blame governments, but you kind of blame everybody. Or it's and even just the price of. I'm imagining you talk about the wire and the steel. As inflation goes up, it's going to be that kind of reciprocal thing of power prices push up inflation, pushes up the price of steel, pushes up the grid, pushes up power prices, pushes up inflation. How do you get out of a spiral like that? Or how are you thinking about the kind of the solve to these kinds of problems?
Well, if I told you that there's actually a solution to both lowering utility bills and connecting new electron sources like AI and data centers to and manufacturing to power new economic development opportunities, a lot of people would say, well, you can only have one or the other. You can't have both affordability and economic development, you can't lower utility bills and meet rising demand. It's one or the other. And that's the general prevailing conventional wisdom that a lot of, for instance, governors and policymakers have taken into this. It's either affordability or economic development. And that creates a tension where right now you're seeing a lot of governors in the US, for instance, chase ribbon cutting ceremonies for new economic development opportunities like data centers, even if their consumers and their voters are concerned about the affordability impacts. But what if I told you that there is a solution to doing both? And that lies in this concept of getting more out of our grid. In fact, in the US, we use our grid extremely inefficiently. The average utilization rate, depending on how you measure it, is anywhere from around 40 to 50%, meaning that we're leaving a lot of low-hanging fruit and juice to squeeze. There's a lot of, meat on the bone, whatever metaphor you want to use to describe the fact that there are a lot of electrons that we could theoretically tap that we're not taking advantage of. And the reason for that is because the way that the US grid works, and pretty much any grid, but the way that the grid works is it's a constant supply and demand equation. The supply of electrons has to always equal the demand for electricity at any given hour in the day, at any given day in the week, any given week in the year. Otherwise, there's going to be blackouts and grid failures and power outages. So it's a constant supply and demand equation. But in the US, the way that we build our grid infrastructure is it's meant to just be oriented around the peak demand. So the hottest summer day at 5 p.m. when everybody's coming back home and from work and turning on their electricity, that's the peak demand, and therefore the peak supply that gets built for the grid is based on that peak demand. So we have tended to overbuild our system because there's only a couple hours of the year where that scenario that I just outlined actually is true. Most of the year, there's a lot of available capacity or slack electrons or grid underutilization, where if we could just flatten the curve, figuratively speaking, and literally speaking, the demand curve, flatten that, we could basically take the grid system that we built and spread those costs over a larger number of electrons and therefore lower the per unit price of electricity and therefore lower utility bills. Now, the reason why we're not doing that, frankly, is it's related to something that you said earlier, which is a lot of people in the US don't realize that their utility companies are for-profit companies with a profit motivation with Wall Street shareholders that structure their incentive and their business model. And people don't necessarily realize that. A lot of people think that their utility companies are a government body or a government agency, but they're actually companies. And they do have a for-profit motive. And in the US, the incentive structure is built such that they make a profit only on building out new capital-intensive infrastructure, new power plants, new power lines, rather than the more operationally efficient solutions that get more out of our grid. They earn a profit on CapEx, but not OpEx. And that creates a significant challenge in this moment where we have all these solutions that can optimize our grid infrastructure and make it more efficient that they are not deploying because it doesn't align with their business model. And that's the reason why our grid is so inefficient most of the time, is that they could adopt these solutions like what's called grid enhancing technologies or energy efficiency or demand response or distributed energy resources or virtual power plants or demand flexibility, these different types of resources that we have available that basically get at this question of how do we get more out of our grid and make it more efficient to lower prices? And they don't do that. And what that means in this moment of a serious affordability crisis is that we need to take a look at that regulatory system, figure out, is this still viable in this era? And how do we align those incentive structures and business models to the contemporary moment that calls for something that does actually reward more efficiency?
Yeah, because how do you take something, like you said, that's 100 years old, built for the needs of a century ago, and we have like unfathomable needs today compared to the people who were building that out 100 years ago, and to try to make it, like, to try to retrofit something into something that's existing. So what you're saying is the goal isn't to just build a bunch. I hear this being spouted all over the place. People say China's building, a squillion gigawatts of power over the next couple of years. They don't really, they're not worried about the environment so much. We're constrained because we're trying to, be good stewards of the earth, or however they frame it. So we can't do that. Therefore, we have to. Oh man, what is happening with this thing?
Grid, China, investing,
Yeah.
building a bunch of
man.
megawatts.
So I keep hearing people, especially on podcasts, news outlets, investors in particular, saying things like, we need to follow the example of China. They're building out huge infrastructure, not just grid, but they're building a lot more power supply. And they're touting, man, we need more supply. But what I hear you saying is, we have a lot of supply already, but we have a very inefficient grid, and we should be trying to take what was built 100 years ago for the needs of 100 years ago, and not just try to kind of bolt on the retrofit, but bring that into the 21st century for 21st century needs, and then look into supply? Or do you think these are just concurrent things? Let's do them both, because we have this 50% inefficiency in the grid. Let's bring that right up. Maybe from a supply chain, they changed from having big stock on hand to just-in-time supply. Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking about with the grid, or is there more efficiency that can be brought out of the grid than just a just-on-time philosophical approach?
It's all of the above. Everything is on the table and needs to be put on the table. And I want to be very clear. There is no doubt that we're going to need to build out a significant increase in new infrastructure. If anything, just to replace the aging grid infrastructure that is reaching its end of its useful life. That is going to cost a lot of money. And we're entering a moment now where electricity demand is rising, not just due to AI and data centers, but also due to manufacturing and due to electrification. As more and more people switch to heat pumps and electric vehicles, that just uses more electricity. And undoubtedly, if you're going to need to triple electricity demand, you're going to need to increase the size of the grid to handle all that new demand. That part is very clear. And I think that's what we're seeing in the narratives around we need to build a grid like China, because China is seeing significant electricity demand increase from those reasons, but also due to population questions, due to economic development questions. Broadly speaking, there are different factors that vary by country in terms of why they're seeing demand increase. But this is definitely a phenomenon that we're seeing in more countries than one, which is rising demand and needing to build out a grid infrastructure to accommodate that. The thing that makes electricity different than almost any other commodity or product or good is the fact that we have set it up as a natural monopoly system where we've said, look, it doesn't make sense for us to duplicate a bunch of poles and wires, especially when you're talking about the poles and wires in your backyard, the distribution poles and wires. Like, imagine if you and your neighbor had different companies that, you would crisscross poles and wires. It doesn't make sense necessarily. And that's why we had this monopoly system. But you'll quickly see that somebody has to pay the cost, and it's the customers of the monopoly utility oftentimes, and not the shareholders, even though it's a for-profit company. For most companies, shareholders often have to pay a lot through investment in the different cost drivers for a given company. For the utility companies, though, oftentimes all of that cost gets recovered and essentially reimbursed by you and I as residential consumers, by small businesses, and by the large commercial and industrial customers. So somebody has to pay the cost of all that new grid infrastructure. And in the US, at least, it is those customers. And so when we talk about a need to triple our grid, it's going to cost a lot of money, and that's going to be borne by consumers. Which raises the question, well, how do you manage the cost increase so that you spread it out so that it, for instance, doesn't come all at once and overwhelms people who already are struggling to pay their bills?
Sure.
It also raises the question, how much is truly necessary investment that's actually benefiting consumers versus how much are the utility companies just proposing building out new power lines because it serves their immediate bottom line?
Sure.
That's a harder question to answer than just something that you can kind of estimate at a high level. And what that means is that it raises questions of transparency, of data access, like who actually has the data to make those decisions? Does the public have a say? It raises questions around regulators. Do they have enough staff? Do they have enough electrical engineers to even be able to evaluate those questions? Because The utility industry is estimating that by the end of this decade, by 2030, they're going to invest $1.1 trillion in new capital. What that really means is that consumers will pay for $1.1 trillion in capital. And that is, for a lot of people, intolerable, layering on the fact that bills are already so high for too many Americans. 80 million Americans can't pay their bills. So there is a question, can you put downward pressure on that $1.1 trillion figure so that it's something that's a bit more palatable? And I think that's where we find ourselves in this moment, is that we need to take the strategic lens of putting the consumer back in the center of the picture and making sure that as we build out this new infrastructure, that we're doing it with the interests of consumers squarely in mind.
Yeah, I had actually considered that monopolistic effect where you just don't have competition because you can't have multiple providers or, with 1,000 wires, drifting across every road and into every house. That would be crazy. Do you find that the systems work better when, like in states where the grid is owned by, or the poles and wires are owned by the government, or where they're privately owned or publicly held companies? Do you find a difference in that? With like you mentioned, slack electrons before, which I love. My Aussie brain thinks about these electrons just kind of lounging around, having a beer waiting to be called up. Are there more or less slack electrons? Can you see the difference in those differently held monopolistic jurisdictions?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's frankly complicated. We get asked all the time, can you point to a state that's doing this well, that is protecting consumers well, that has a good grid, both technologically and from a regulatory standpoint? And my answer every single time is, to be honest, no. No state is doing it well. In fact, it's hard to point to one state that, across whatever metric you want to use, but let's just take the two most basic objectives of our grid: affordability, reliability.
Mm-hmm.
There's, at this point, it's hard to find states that are even achieving those two basic pieces well. I'll give you an example. In Texas, which is a truly competitive electricity market, where on the wholesale side, on the generation side, that is totally competitive. And then on the retail side, in terms of the service provider that directly interfaces with you as the customer, that's also competitive. That's different than a neighboring state like Georgia, where it's the same company that both produces the electrons, that transmits those electrons into your backyard, and ultimately is the company that's the name and face on your utility bill. They're two neighboring states, basically the polar opposites of utility regulation in the US. And, it's kind of hard to say, depending on your objective. You could even add a third objective, which is decarbonization and clean energy.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, some would say Texas, wow, it's now the number one state in the US for solar and wind deployment. It has now outpaced California. And there are still asterisks, because some of the most ugly, salient grid outages and power failures have come in the state of Texas recently due to various winter storms like Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Elliott, where people died due to winter storm freezes where natural gas plants shut down and where there wasn't enough generation. And so there were power outages that left people out without heat. In the winter storm with several inches of snow in Texas, that caused people to die. And that's not great either. But part of the challenge there is that's also somewhat avoidable, because Texas chose to be totally disconnected from the rest of the US electric grid. And they did that from a principle of freedom, which is to not be regulated by the federal regulatory body called FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So there is a trade-off. In other words, if Texas didn't have that issue, well, maybe it could be pointed to as the shining example, but it's hard to do that when it has these reliability challenges. So I think every state is experiencing different challenges, and it's not as easy as, well, if every state just did this, then everything would be fine. If every state just had public power, everything would be fine. It's not always that simple. And in the US, we have the benefit of this laboratories of democracy where there's almost 50 different experiments going on. Frankly, if there were one experiment that clearly was head and shoulders above everybody else, everybody would try to copy that, but that doesn't exist.
I imagine All right. Do you find that in larger states like Texas, like you just mentioned, is the grid a more difficult concern than maybe in a smaller state? Yeah, I was expecting when you said, let's look at the 50 experiments, that the smaller states will be doing better because perhaps the grid is less complicated or less moving parts or even less people. But is that really a factor, or are some large states doing it well or better, smaller states doing it less well, or is that just not really a factor or a variable?
I don't think that's really a factor, in part because actually there are some examples where smaller states actually are even more complicated. And, just take population, right? Like, let's look at the state of Maine. Maine has had the single highest increase in electricity prices over the last 5 years in the US, and prices there are now some of the highest in the country. Part of the challenge there is actually there's not that many people that live in Maine, and they're very spread out. So you're both paying more because the grid infrastructure needs to reach more rural pockets of the state, and there are fewer customers to spread those costs over. And there's been a lot of storms that have caused a lot of damage to the grid that it costs a lot of money to replace, repair, and to reinvest in the grid infrastructure. So both the costs are quite substantial, and the number so that's the numerator, and the number of customers is not that large. So that's the denominator. So if you merge those two together, that's why the price increases are quite dramatic in a state like Maine. Take a big state like California, similar issues where, well, there are some benefits of, Los Angeles, San Francisco. Those are pretty dense pockets of people, and there's a high population in those. But then even for a utility like Pacific Gas and Electric, which serves the Bay Area, it also serves pretty remote rural parts of the state as well that are really prone to wildfire risk. And in those rural areas, those wildfires, they have taken down grid infrastructure. They've ignited sparks that have actually triggered further wildfires when those wildfires hit the grid. And so that's created a lot of cost for the utility company. And California now has some of the highest electricity prices in the country, in part for that reason as well, because it just costs so much money for the utility company to service those rural areas that have also been battered by wildfires. So just to give you some examples, it's not so simple as just that one thing. And I should note that, frankly, the US really is a big interconnected grid at the end of the day. And there's really three grids: what's called the Western Interconnect, the Eastern Interconnect, and then ERCOT, which is Texas. Basically, Texas is ERCOT. So you imagine if you divided the US into the West, the East, and Texas. Those are the three constituent grids that make up the US grid. So in a way, it's all kind of connected at the end of the day.
Yeah, gotcha. In the state that I live, a couple of years ago, the entire state lost power. We were connected to a neighboring state, but we also leading the way in our country. Our state is for renewable energy, and just all went down. Yeah, we had a statewide blackout. This is where even Elon Musk called up the government and said, "Hey, government, if I could make you a battery in 100 days, would you take it?" And that's when we got a bit more serious. We're not the Texas of Australia. That'll be Queensland. But geographically, we are, in the bottom, in the middle, down the bottom, and about the same size too. So yeah, man, that interconnectedness. Surely, I know in the States it's different because the appetite for working at a national level versus at a state level, there are very strong lines drawn, right, between states, and some states have those lines drawn in big bold marker, and some kind of have them, dotted in pencil. But how are you thinking nationally about how do you meet the needs of all those consumers? And the consumer need is going up as well, right? Because, like you say, heat pumps, electric vehicles, those kinds of things are becoming more popular. In my house, we have no gas supply. We only have electrical supply, for example. I know that's becoming more popular as well. But then you have businesses and companies and even manufacturing, like you say, and maybe more manufacturing happening in the States than a couple of years ago. Got data centers at the moment and many more on the rise. How do you meet the needs of all of those stakeholders in a way that demand is increasing? Like you said before, you need to make the grid more efficient and increase supply. Is this just a factor of will? Is it a factor of just money? Is it just a factor of time? It'll happen over time. Are there cultural changes that need to happen, like in the psyche of Americans? Is it purely regulatory? What's the solution?
Well, none of this is simple. If it were, it would have already been solved.
Sure.
I think that the complexity
Sometimes things
and
are
actually,
simple, but there's no will to do it because of
well, that's true.
commercial and other kind of reasons. But yeah, go on.
I think that, and this is actually what fascinates me the most about working in this problem space and working on the grid, is that you think of it like it's just this technological and engineering and physics challenge. Really, what makes the grid, to me at least, so fascinating and stimulating to think about, let alone work on, is that there is the economics of everything that I just described. And it's not just your traditional economics either. It's monopolies, it's utility regulation. There's the law, the legal piece of regulation. There's the social piece of thinking again about the 80 million Americans who can't pay their bills and are trading off food, education, healthcare, who are keeping their homes at unsafe and unhealthy temperatures just to pay their bills.
Nice.
There is the cultural dimension of the utility companies themselves, who are very risk averse and maybe aren't as forward thinking, but even that's changing in this moment where there's a lot more innovation demand. So there's really so many pieces to this puzzle. So that's why it's in part hard to crack, because you have to really do all of that and align all of those pieces that I just mentioned in the same direction
Mhm.
going forward. And at the same time, I think some of the biggest bottlenecks that we're seeing in the US around energy and the challenges that people consistently across the industry and space talk about, they're increasingly regulatory in nature. So things like siting and permitting of energy projects, both clean energy projects and fossil fuel projects. To get a permit, to get a license, to be able to know where to put your project is not a simple thing, particularly in the context of we were hearing more and more about NIMBYism in the US around
Mhm.
people opposing the build out of certain energy projects in their backyard, things like that. So that's one. The second is things like interconnection queues. This is a pretty wonky concept in the power sector and the electricity system, but it basically gets at this idea that when you're connecting new sources of energy onto the grid, in order to make sure that the grid can actually handle those new electrons, you need to do a study and get in line. And that's called the interconnection queue, where you're a developer, you want to build a project. You can't, it's not as simple as just you go rogue and build the project and connect it on the grid. There's a process. That's called the interconnection queue. But that queue has now had such a large backlog and logjam that pretty unbelievably, there is more energy waiting to be connected to the grid in the US than there is on the grid itself.
Wow.
That's a pretty remarkable statement. That's how backlogged the queue is. That's a lot of it is regulatory in nature.
Yeah.
When we think about things like transmission constraints and how do you go about planning the grid, and it requires the coordination of a lot of stakeholders. As you can imagine, it requires federal actors because it crosses state lines. It requires individual states to comply and to consent. It requires basically figuring out how to spread those costs. So if you have a power line that goes through 3 states, well, do you put a third of the cost in each of the 3? Well, what if one of the states gets more of the share of the benefits? Should they pay more because they benefit more? Or maybe it costs more to get through one of the states than the others. Should they pay more because they cause more costs? So there's different types of principles when it comes to something like what's called cost allocation. How do you spread these costs over different types of folks? And so that's another complexity. But the point is that the challenges and the bottlenecks that we're now seeing in the US electricity system are increasingly regulatory in nature. They're not so much about the technology. They're not so much about the economics. They're really in large part now about the regulatory piece. I will say though that going forward, as the issue of electric prices and utility bills becomes increasingly politically salient, there will be another dimension, which is now the politics of electricity. We are entering a new era, which is a new politics of electricity. And that is going to create some interesting dynamics as it relates to the grid and what's going to take shape going forward.
Yeah, man. How are you viewing it philosophically about power supply? Like, they talk about fundamental human rights in terms of things like safety and shelter and food and those access to food and those kind of things. Even they're talking about internet as a fundamental human right these days. Surely power, being able to get some electrons into your house is one of those fundamental things that, for me personally, I'm always a little weary about what the government kind of looks after and the inefficiencies there. And I mean, a lot of different issues, perhaps with the government having more and more power. But it seems to me that this is one of those things that the government should be trying to ensure that people have not just access to, but affordable access to. I know that introduces more variables and more complications, and the more stakeholders you have and more advocacy groups for everybody. How do you align the incentives of government, people, like the regulators in the government, the providers themselves, business, data centers? How are we ever supposed to align all of those incentives?
That's an easy question. That's the $1 million question. $1 trillion in this context around the new AI economy. Look, it's complicated. I don't want to pretend that there are some simple solutions and fixes. I do think that no matter what happens with the electric system, whether suddenly, a bunch of utilities become municipalized and they no longer have a profit motivation, or whether you expand electricity markets in America, like in the 90s and 2000s, when suddenly a bunch of regions like the Mid-Atlantic and Texas and California and the Midwest and New England went to this competitive wholesale market where the generation piece of energy was now made competitive instead of a monopoly, or whether you're just switching to the vertically integrated model that we've known for over 100 years. Regardless of what happens, which I don't want to pretend to be a prophet and know what that's going to look like, the bottom line is that there is going to be a chunk of the grid of the regulatory system that will need a public utilities commission that's doing its job. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't make sense for there to be a bunch of crisscrossing poles and wires, at least in your backyard. You could argue that you don't need one monopoly company to build new energy projects. That now has proven out to be potentially competitive in many instances. Not potentially, it's been proven out to be competitive in a sense. But the point is that regardless of those end structures, consumers don't have enough of a voice right now. The regulatory bodies don't have enough resources right now, and we're going to need to make sure that we increase the resources to the regulatory bodies and increase the power of the consumers, because there's too much money at stake. There's too much more than just money, to be honest, at stake. It's really about the fate of the economic system and whether people will feel like it will continue to work, because frankly, the new politics of electricity, part of why it's so interesting is that in the US, in Virginia, for instance, there are more and more fights against data centers because they're seen as driving up people's utility bills. And the reality is that the relationship between data centers and electricity bills is actually very complicated. It's not as simple as saying more data centers means more bills. It's not that simple, even though in a lot of people's minds it is that simple. But it's not that simple, and I think there's a lot more work around educating people about how the utility regulatory system works. But the point is that consumers do feel like they don't have enough power in a moment where there's a few economic actors that many would say have too much power, and they want to reclaim some of that power and feel like they have a voice. So I think that in terms of on a going forward basis, what's going to happen is that if we don't figure out how to give consumers that voice and have a little bit more balance in how we make these decisions, that the potential political risks of consumer backlash will be very strong. And I'm not sure that that's a scenario that people want either. So I think there's a window here where we need to get this right and make sure that consumers are actually benefiting from these decisions going forward.
Where's the low-hanging fruit? It seems to me that even in what you've said already today, if there's only a 50% efficiency in the grid or 50% capacity, it's built for the day of heaviest or the few hours of heaviest demand, but we're almost never there. And then on the other hand, we have an entire additional 50% of power supply just waiting to go online. Is it just political will to kind of, do we flick a switch and make the grid 50% more efficient? And do we flick a switch or sign some papers and suddenly have twice as much supply online? Is it as easy? Is that the lowest hanging fruit, or are there more simple things that can be done for immediate effect?
I think it's that, actually. And, when you say political will, I don't even mean capital P political like politics. I mean, do we as people and as a society have the will to reimagine our regulatory system and our business models and our incentive structures and the way that we plan for the grid? And I think undoubtedly the answer, at least the answer that I tell myself, is yes. That's why we started Power Lines, because we have a belief that we can do that we need to do that in order for this to work. The question is just, how do we operationalize that? And I do think that we are a far cry from that. But the fact that governors are talking about this issue of rising utility bills, the fact that comedians and late night talk show hosts and news anchors and TikTok influencers and all sorts of people that never would have touched this issue are talking about it, means that people are making their voices heard and they're hearing from people about the fact that this structure no longer works. So we've been talking about things like getting more out of our grid for, and realigning utility incentives and reimagining the utility regulatory system for, frankly, decades. But we haven't been able to put that into practice because we haven't had the motivation from the public, the quote unquote political will that you just described, to do that. And I think that now we do. Now there is that window where people are now engaged and want to engage as consumers and make their voices heard. That is the political will, if we can harness it and use that as a lever for reform and modernizing our utility regulatory system. And I think it's possible.
So when you say organizing power, is that some of the stuff that you are involved in?
Yeah, we're very interested in figuring out how we can make sure that consumers have more power in our regulatory system and making sure that they have a say. Because, look, we set up, again, our electric system over 100 years ago when we invented and commercialized electricity for the purpose of, wow, this is an incredible modern invention, and we ought to figure out a way to get this to everybody. Every human being, every person should have access to this electricity, almost as a foundational human right. And when we think about how much power the electric system has over people's day-to-day lives, both at the macro level with thinking about the economy and how much from manufacturing to AI, literally the entire economy runs on electricity. Yeah. And if we don't have it, then the rest doesn't work. And at the microscopic level, if you don't have electricity, you can't do almost anything that you need in a modern lifestyle. And from cooking and showering and eating and studying and working, all of that requires electricity. This is such a powerful invention and product that we have commercialized. It would be a shame for us to lose sight of that vision that we set up over 100 years ago to say, look, we discovered this, we invented it, we modernized it, we commercialized it, and consumers, the public, isn't the primary beneficiary. So I think in this moment, it offers an opportunity for all of us to take a step back, reflect, look back, look forward, and say, how do we make sure that we put that vision of a consumer-oriented energy system back in the central frame so that moving forward, consumers have a say and are ultimately who benefits from all of this.
Yeah, man. Are there any promising technological advancements? I mean, obviously people are spending billions of dollars trying to make power production more efficient and better. I've heard a lot of talk about SMR recently, and even people, trying to crack fusion and those kinds of things. I'm wondering, what about in the grid? I think about, the way that we are communicating right now. It used to be copper wires and then fiber and then Wi-Fi and then, satellite. What is there any work being done technologically on the grid itself? Like, I'm not suggesting we'll have wireless electrons ever. I don't know, maybe we will. But is there anything that's being done to make the grid actually technologically better? Or are we still operating on a century-old technology in that regard?
There is. And this is exciting because there are solutions like grid enhancing technologies, what are called GETs, that basically you can think of these as hardware and software solutions that unlock more juice, more electrons out of our existing grid infrastructure. Exactly what we talked about earlier. These are the technological solutions. So there's a couple specific ones, things like dynamic line ratings, which are hardware solutions that you put on the grid, and basically they adjust the ratings of the power lines so that we set our line ratings pretty conservatively so that during, the hot summer months, you don't put too many electrons so as to overheat the grid and cause a lot of sag. These technologies can basically more dynamically adjust those ratings so that depending on the weather conditions, depending on the season, depending on the dynamic state or environment, you're adjusting it so that it's not just the most conservative, so that you can put more electrons through during times when the grid can handle that. That's one way to unlock more electrons. There's other solutions like power flow control or advanced topology optimization. Often these are kind of software solutions like Waze, which manages traffic on the grid, or Waze, you use it for cars for traffic. In a way, advanced some of these solutions like topology optimization are similar in that it routes electrons accordingly. So there are these solutions that exist, and they actually are extremely cost effective. The payback period for some of these grid enhancing technologies is as short as months in some cases. So I like to describe them as ibuprofen for the grid because it doesn't solve all the systemic challenges of new demand and how do we connect new electrons, but it does do a good job of providing some near-term immediate relief to the grid and unlocks some immediate electrons and value at a significant discount to consumers. So there is innovation like that. And then the other bucket of innovation that I would put forth is things that are AI solutions for the grid. So things like better mapping of our grid architecture and infrastructure so that we can plan ahead for storms and make sure that those pockets of the grid are properly resilient and robust against those storms. There are ways to incorporate AI into the operations of the grid so that if there is a wildfire, maybe you can use AI to detect those issues and basically turn off the power lines quicker and more proactively. That can put significant downward pressure on costs. So there's a bucket of those types of solutions. And there's companies like Tapestry, which is housed under Google, for instance, which is using AI solutions to help one of the grid operators in the US called PJM, which covers the Mid-Atlantic region. They also do work in Chile and other countries as well that basically use AI for the grid to better plan and better manage the operations of the grid. And that's pretty exciting. And those solutions could have the potential to significantly alleviate some of the grid pressures that we've been talking about. And that's a pretty optimistic vision of the future.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds awesome. So, the proverbial wave a magic wand, or you're put in charge of the grid nationally for the next year. What do you think is your first, like what's the primary importance, or what's the very first thing you think that needs to happen?
I think it's making sure that public utility commissions do their job and are resourced to do their job. Like, I think a lot of the challenges that we've been talking about are because we've lost sight of that utility regulatory system. And there's a lot of reasons why we have. In some cases, we are truly underinvesting in these government bodies. They barely have a couple electrical engineers who do the work of, these regulatory bodies need to exist because it's a monopoly. It's like I said, Econ 101, by definition, these bodies need to exist. So you can't just say, well, we'll get rid of all of it. Well, that's not going to work because then there's literally no body to scrutinize costs and make sure that they're as fair as possible for consumers. It's not like any other products, in other words. So these regulatory bodies need to exist. But we have to ask ourselves, are we actually investing in them properly and robustly and in the ways and amounts and quantities and mechanisms that we should be investing in them? And I think the answer is decidedly no. A lot of these public utility commissions are a couple dozen staff, especially in some of these smaller states. Compare that with the utility companies that are often thousands of staff. So there's a huge disparity and mismatch there where we're not even resourcing and equipping and setting these commissions up for success. So if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to put resources behind these public utility commissions. It's not just money and budgets. It's also things like prestige. Like from the standpoint of attracting the most talented folks, I would argue that there are few places that are more impactful, especially early on in someone's career, to learn and grow than working at a PUC, at a Public Utilities Commission, because these bodies cover so much breadth. You can go in so much depth around a utility proposing, to increase rates and making sure, okay, is this just and reasonable? Is this actually prudent investment? To utility resource plans and forecasting future demand and saying we're going to need to build out this much solar, this much wind, this much nuclear, this much hydro, this much geothermal. That is so intellectually fascinating, at least I would say. And there's a huge breadth and depth to that work. It's very flavorful. But these bodies are not what some of the most talented, best and brightest folks, that's their first thought is, I'm going to work at a Public Utilities Commission. And, there are broader questions like on how do you get people to work in public service and feel like that's a prestigious role. To some degree in the US, that's less of an issue at the federal level with the White House. People really want to work for the White House.
Sure.
But these Public Utilities Commissions, they're not as shiny, they're not as sexy, they're not as glamorous. And so a lot of people don't think of working there. But all of this packaged together, I think if we can just put a spotlight on these Public Utilities Commissions, these PUCs, these U.S. Supreme Court Justices of Energy, where every commissioner on average oversees $1 billion worth of utility investments, and where arguably you're at the nexus point of the biggest macroeconomic issue of our time, which is AI, and the biggest microeconomic issue of our time, which is utility bills. You're at the nexus of that at PUCs. If we can really resource them and attract and build talent pipelines to these bodies and put consumers at the center of the vision, I really think that going forward, we can unlock all of these win-win opportunities, modernizing our grid, connecting new sources of economic development, lowering utility bills, and actually putting a vision out there that everybody can get behind.
Yeah, man, that is a very good vision for the future, I think, because yeah, you're right. It's if we leave things the way it is now, things will not naturally get better, right? Unless there's the juice X, technological advancement that comes out, and we can all have a little, fusion reactor in our backyard or whatever. This is not gonna go away. It's not gonna get better without considered effort and without aligning those incentives that are currently really all over the place. Charles, I really appreciate your time today. Before you go, one question we'd like to ask, I guess, is: do you have any particularly contrarian views that our viewers and listeners might be able to benefit from, where most people think in one direction, but you actually think it's the other way? Doesn't have to be controversial. We're just wondering if we can know for any contrarian views.
Sure. I think that the increasing politicization of rising utility bills can be a net positive thing for America and for the grid.
Right.
A lot of people are concerned because this has been a historically wonky technical issue. And don't get me wrong, as somebody who respects and deeply admires and appreciates the work of and just how complex our grid is from a physics and engineering standpoint, that this is inherently contrarian, that somehow politicians talking about it is a good thing. But I think it's a symptom of the fact that people want to feel like they can make their voice heard as consumers, that they felt like they've been neglected for so long that finally here's an opportunity for them to take part in the process. And that's why we're seeing it spill out into the politics. Now, of course, there are risks of that, where you have people who have no idea about energy talking about energy and pretending that they know everything about energy and then making decisions based on that. I would say, though, that electricity has always been politicized, especially in America, when we think about how different political parties and politicians have talked about things like clean energy and renewable energy and fossil fuels. There is a very significant partisan split. So this issue has always been politicized. What hasn't always been the case is consumers being engaged and feeling like they have a say in how this system works or doesn't work. And in a moment where 80 million Americans can't pay their utility bills, 1 in 3 households can't pay their utility bills. They're trading off, again, food, education, healthcare, rent, just to make ends meet. In the wealthiest country in the world, in the most energy-rich country in the world, that is a pretty searing indictment of how the utility regulatory system has not worked for consumers. Yeah. So the fact that people are engaged and it's spilling out into our politics, I think if anything, it signals that people care and want to see change. And I think if we harness that properly, that is the force that can unlock all of the things that we've talked about today. Because the vision that we outlined is within grasp and reach, but it's going to require hard work and the ability to make sure that we put those consumers, the end users of our grid, back in the center of the entire process and outcome. And I think that's the possibility here. And I think that if we take advantage of this moment where people are paying attention and do it well, that we can have hopefully really good things going forward.
Charles, if someone wants to hear more from you or learn more about the work of Powerlines, where can they find you online?
You can find us at powerlines.org, and we have a lot of resources talking about public utilities commissions, how they work, who they are, who serves on them, information about every state, and you can learn more about our work too. We put out quarterly reports talking about how utility rate increase requests in 2025 have set a record of any year. You can find different media articles that we're cited in and different partnerships that we have. We are super excited and eager to hear from you and learn from what's happening in your country or your state if you're in the US, and would love to partner. I think it's very clear that solving this issue isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take the concerted effort, a lot of different stakeholders, perhaps even with divergent interests coming together and for the greater good of consumers and the public interest, making sure that the system works. So if you're a government entity or a policymaker or a company or a energy developer or a think tank or a nonprofit or an advocacy group or a everyday consumer, regardless of where you fall under that spectrum, please reach out. You can find us at powerlines.org. You can personally reach out at charles@powerlines.org, and we would love to hear from you and look forward to talking to more folks soon.
Charles, really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Off Chain. We love bringing you great guests like Charles and hope we've inspired you to learn more about technology, about AI, about Web3, about the future and how you might be a part of building it. As always, please like, subscribe, or better yet, share this episode with a friend. Help us spread the word and join us again next week for another exciting episode of Off Chain, hopefully with a better voice. Till then, take care.